You know, I was listening before to what John was saying, and I actually thought to myself, I think I'm a bit superfluous here. I have to say to you that when I was asked to do this, I couldn't quite work out what I should say to you, and I thought to myself, you know, one of the problems that we've got now is we think that everything can be done by legislative fiat. We think that everything can just be sort of changed overnight, and of course it can't be. One of the things that I did think about is this question of whether or not we ought to have a Bill of Religious Rights. Now, before Scott Morrison took over the Liberal Party, I know that there were a lot of people mumbling about this and saying perhaps what we need is a specific Bill of Religious Rights. The only problem with that is that we actually don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia. Our constitution is not actually set up like that. And we actually do have religious rights. We have had religious rights since the foundation of this country. And we have to start thinking about now how we're going to actually formulate this. Can it be formulated into a bill? I suspect that Morrison's declaration that he wanted a Bill of Religious Rights was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction. And we have to be very careful about these things. Now, originally, I was in favour of it. After the same-sex marriage vote, I thought, yes, this is what we need. And I know several members of the Catholic hierarchy in particular are in favour of it. I know particularly that Bishop Porteous is, Archbishop Porteous, for obvious reasons. I'll go into that in a bit. But one of the things that I started to think about was how this is going to be formulated and how much of this stuff can you put into a bill which has to be defined. And that's the problem. So I changed my mind, because sometimes people change their mind. I changed my mind on this issue. Not because of the things that generated all the problems. I haven't changed my mind about any of that. But I have changed my mind about whether or not we ought to have a bill. Because two things are actually very striking in this discussion. First of all, of course, we all want freedom of religion because it's a fundamental right, which we already thought we had, of course, and we do. Secondly, the whole debate is couched not in terms of the basic human rights as set out in the international instruments to which we are signatories, or even the long-standing constitutional rights which we inherited from the British Constitution, and particularly since the Act of Emancipation. It's not seen through any of those prisms. It's simply seen through the very limited prism of identity politics. So this is, of course, because of the same-sex marriage law, which we were told would settle that question. But it has not, because it wasn't actually about marriage, was it? What it was really about was widening the power of the identity-obsessed elites trying to set up competing ideas of human rights. These are defined and policed by the growing power of extra-parliamentary instruments like the Human Rights Commission. And as Archbishop Julian Porteous' case in Tasmania illustrates, these commissions have been used to actually narrow our rights. Now, I'm supposing that most of you here know about what happened to Archbishop Porteous. Archbishop Porteous was asked, along with all the other bishops in Australia, this wasn't simply something that he did, this was actually done by all the bishops. There was a pamphlet that they wanted to put out during the discussion on same-sex marriage about what the fundamental teachings are on marriage. And it's the same for all Christians. Marriage is between a man and a woman because the main purpose of marriage is to sanctify the union, which can of itself produce children. That's the most important thing. And that's why we have legal marriage, because that union, and only that union, can of itself produce children. So the idea about same-sex marriage is actually the wrong end of the stick, because marriage isn't just a personal union. It's a union which can produce children, or rather the sexual relationship between people of opposite sex can produce children, so therefore, rationally, only people who can produce children really should have the right to marry, or putatively so, because not everyone can, of course, have a child. Various reasons they can't. So this was the basic teaching of the church. In the pamphlet, the question of homosexuality or homosexual marriage or anything to do with homosexuality wasn't even mentioned. It wasn't actually mentioned. All they did was set out that teaching. Now the bishops decided that this would go everywhere, all over Australia. So it wasn't just in Tasmania, it wasn't just in Archbishop Porteous's diocese, it went everywhere. And the upshot of that, the natural sequence would have been, if this complaint by a transsexual person who complained that it denigrated homosexuals and transsexuals, if that complaint had been upheld, then the entire Bishops' Conference would have then been subject to that complaint. Not just Archbishop Porteous. Do you understand what I'm saying? The entire Bishops' Conference. And in other words, it was an attempt to attack Catholic doctrine, Catholic views. Of course, it wasn't ever really going to happen. It wasn't really going to work. They couldn't really do that. But I mean, the punishment was the process for a start. The Archbishop was held up with this thing for over a year. More than that, I think 18 months. He had to go backwards and forwards and forwards and backwards. And he had to constantly put his case. I actually told him when he rang me up, I said, why didn't you just tell him to get nicked? He said, because I'll get fined. And I said, oh, well, okay. And of course, the document went out everywhere and went out in all schools. And in fact, there are little pockets, you know. There are pockets of radicalism in Catholic schools just as there are everywhere else, because they take a very broad section of the population. And it started to cause even a lot of upset and a lot of discussion and a lot of fights in schools amongst teachers and amongst kids. In fact, I happen to know that in my mum's old school in Sydney, Our Lady of Mercy at Parramatta, there was a girl who took it out and burnt it. So it goes to show you this kind of thing has widespread undercurrents. So it wasn't just the bishop that was being persecuted. The whole idea of what the doctrine is on Christian marriage was supposedly up for grabs. So that's what happened there. So I want to point out that if a Bill of Rights can be formulated, it'll have to be policed under the anti-discrimination legislation, and that's the problem. So why not put religious rights into the Human Rights Commission and formulate a Bill of Religious Rights? Well, simply because we don't need one. As George Brandis once pointed out, religious and conscientious rights actually trump anti-discrimination rights. What we need to do is get rid of the human rights commissions. Now, the thing is, you see, that rights which spring from freedom of conscience and religion are quite broad. This is where both the difficulties and the dangers lie in trying to define those rights, as they must be defined in any bill. Even the industry bodies, and I don't know if you noticed this, but this was only published in the paper 2 days ago, the industry bodies who will be affected by this have come out against such a bill, mainly because of the difficulty of definition. So why is definition so difficult? Now, we all know here that religion isn't a set of rubrics. Even though the Greens and the far left would like to confine religion in that way. We can't confine religion just to the pulpit, which is how they brought the case against Porteous, because one of the things they said is that Porteous was trying to use children in spreading religious doctrine. I mean, this is bizarre. This is quite bizarre. They said rather than acknowledge that those views, that doctrine was a valid part of their education and their upbringing in Catholic families, no, they said, you can't do that. You can't use children to convey your ideology, right? You can't do that. No, you can say what you like from the pulpit. This is what I actually read all their stuff on their on the Greens websites about this and how they were going to set the case up, and this is how they set it up. You can say whatever you like from the pulpit, but you can't use children to convey these things. I mean, it's quite bizarre. So what they tried to do was to simply narrow the purview of religion, and this is what they are going to continue to do. They're going to try to narrow that the whole purview of religion. They're going to say it's okay from the pulpit, but it's not okay in other ways. You can't bring it into the workplace. You can't bring it here. You can't bring it there. Well, we already know of some examples where that's happened. Of course, it's rubbish because religion encompasses everything in life. It's part of an entire outlook. It's your way of thinking and acting and living. It also, of course, as a lot of people in this group will know, it has cultural baggage. Any offspring of the Irish or Italian diaspora, that's me, finds it's very pertinent. Never mind the Lebanese or the Vietnamese one, or not to mention the Assyrian one, or the Jewish one. How can we hope to define all this? How can you hope to define all that stuff in a single bill? And more importantly, who is going to do the definitions of what can and can't be included in such a bill? Now, already, as Israel Folau has discovered, the ability to publicly state certain beliefs will be governed by definitions of what is and isn't allowable under an arbitrary set of rules and legal precedent. And in the draft of the bill, it depends on the amount of turnover of the companies. I don't know whether any of you realise this. It actually depends on the monetary value of the companies, of what you can and can't say. So if yes, that's right. If you are working for a company that has a revenue of over 50 million, then you can say whatever you like. If it's under 50 million, then you can't. This is actually in the draft version of the bill. So how can... I mean, if one's ability to speak out actually will depend on the monetary value of the business. At the moment, from a common law stance, you can do whatever you want to do in religion, as long as there's no law impeding you, like don't blow up your neighbour or something. We are party to the UN Declaration of Civil and Political Rights, and we have Section 116 of the Constitution, which forbids the establishment of religion, as in the old motherland, which is an oblique way to confirm our freedom, as it forbids tests of religion. So with religious conviction or none, we are free. It is the human rights apparatus that's making us less free. So the latest left argument is that we will only tolerate freedom of worship. We won't tolerate supporting a religious view outside that. Hence it encompasses Commonwealth aid to schools, hospitals, social welfare, because that's what will happen. However, this is actually contrary to the idea of being publicly able to state and act on religious conviction, including educating children as their parents see fit. The Green Left also seek, through the funding argument, to compromise the right of religious institutions to employ and the right to control enrolment in schools. At the moment, religious institutions can do all this through the exemptions to the anti-discrimination provisions, and what's more, even the left recognise that trying to tear down a system of schools and hospitals in the Catholic sector, which supplements those run by the state, is unrealistic. Just to touch on the exemptions for a moment, Archbishop Porteous is particularly against this, and I've had a lot of argument with him about it. He doesn't feel that we should have to rely on exemptions, and he's got a point. That's a valid point. We shouldn't have to rely on exemptions, because having to rely on exemptions means that we're outside the regular polity. Somehow we're just sort of weirdos stuck out there on the edge. So we have to have exemptions as if we're, I don't know, disabled or sort of a bit infantile or something like that. And he would like to get rid of the exemptions altogether. But the problem is that if you rely solely on a bill, then you are confined by definitions. So that the exemptions at least provide some surety that you don't have to be confined in one way. So this is a very tricky question. I have no idea how they're going to get over this. Actually, to get back to the question of the public funding of religious institutions, they should also realise that since there are 800,000 kids in Catholic schools alone, and in fact a third of the nation's children all go to private schools, this is an unrealistic thing. But they will try it a bit at a time. The state actually relies too heavily on that system, and aside from the practical argument, interfering with those things could now end up as a freedom of religion case in the High Court. So this is the moment to try to get some sort of settlement from both sides of politics. It would be a very dangerous precedent and could backfire badly if a Bill of Religious Rights were used to further the power not of the people through the Parliament, but of the judiciary, as in Canada. In fact, through the Canadian Statutory Bill of Rights, they've even passed a law legalising euthanasia as a statutory right. So this is where bills of rights are very dangerous things. It's no accident, of course, that our most famous reformist Liberal judge, Michael Kirby, is in favour of a Bill of Rights. So this is the time. This is the time we have to think about this, and this is the time we could get some kind of settlement from both sides of politics. Why? Because the ALP is in mea culpa mode at the moment after their disastrous showings at the last election. Albanese has suddenly discovered that all that "we respect you" stuff doesn't wash. Religious doesn't mean stupid. The ALP is embarrassed by the fact that they were not supported by people who really care about their religion, particularly in the same-sex marriage vote. Remember those 5 seats at the edge of Sydney that all went to no? You know why they went to no, because there were so many people there for both religious and cultural reasons who were not particularly keen on the idea. So the ALP are trying anything to win back the vote, particularly from the multicultural group, particularly from them. They're even trying to push their latest star, Christina Keneally, to try to do this. I mean, she's been nominated as the left's token religious person. Her views are aimed at a liberal Catholic view, which is meant to give the Labor Party a broad religious appeal, although her utterances often don't gel with church teaching or tradition. And what's more, they don't really gel with a lot of the very deeply conservative, I know this in the Catholic world, because although there's a little bit of a schism going on with the trendies, the real work in the centre is done by the Conservatives. And I won't talk too much about that. I'll ask you. You can ask me questions after this anyway. So Labor's actions have actually betrayed their real lack of concern about religion. Even their Ed Husic, for example, who was one of the most right-wing members of the caucus, was a Muslim, and he was chucked out because he was too right-wing and too religious too. Meanwhile, actually, this is the problem. The only person who actually is going to have carriage of a bill on the Labor side is Mark Dreyfus, who is the most ideologically committed of them all. He's part of the Labor left, who in concert with the Greens determined to narrow religious liberty, and there's no question about this, abandoning the religious exemptions within the anti-discrimination laws is stated policy of both Labor and the Greens. In fact, Dreyfus's last act before leaving office as Attorney General was to get rid of the religious exemptions covering aged care, and he saw that as a valuable precedent. In religious circles and among the Catholic bishops, there's always been dissatisfaction that religious institutions are reliant on the exemptions. Archbishop Porteous, as I said to you before, is very concerned for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's too easy to override the exemptions, as Dreyfus has shown, by already doing it in aged care. He got that one under the radar, and a lot of people don't even realise that it's been done. If Labor ever get into government, hospitals and schools will be next. They'll use the arguments about Catholic hospitals not providing the full range of reproductive care, the code for abortion, to try to limit funding and to even close institutions. And I don't know how many of you remember this, that the ACT government tried this once already in the case of Calvary, which is actually a public hospital. Schools will be the next target, and the left don't have to be in government for this to happen, actually. This will be a very easy one because they will use the employment provisions for religious schools, and even more effectively, they will use the gender identity arguments for students and teachers, setting up artificial test cases and lawfare. In fact, I think this has already been done, and I think John already has mentioned it about the woman in Ballarat. Yes. And don't think that a Bill of Rights of religious freedom is going to help matters at all, because that woman in Victoria has actually agreed as a teacher to abide by the school's ethos. However, she's claimed that her views on gay marriage, which she said are based on her personal religious convictions and the school's views, which are based on Orthodox Christian teaching, are not compatible. So how are you going to get over that? She claims she was sacked just for that reason. So a bill wouldn't necessarily protect a school against lawfare like that, because her personal views might in fact override the school's. Think about it. So what could happen is the whole of the Religious Rights Bill could become a weapon for lawfare, and that's all. And it will become a weapon to curtail and narrow the current religious rights of religious institutions. One solution that has been posited by Archbishop Porteous and might let Morrison off the hook on the religious liberty question and avoid a bill would be to make a declaration, like the Sorry Statement, making reference to both our ancient liberties and the freedoms that we've signed up to in the international covenants. Because, as George Brandes quite rightly said some time ago, religious liberty trumps anti-discrimination law. And it's not just because it's a more anti-discrimination law is a more recent and malleable concept, but also because anti-discrimination law is of a different qualitative value to religious liberty. Because religion isn't about identity. It isn't about how you're perceived in the world or even under the law, how you are treated. It's more fundamental to your rights as a citizen than that. Because fundamentally it's about how you think and what you believe is right or wrong. So in other words, it's about your conscience. The right to a free conscience cannot be defined like other more material rights in the law. Remember, always remember, a bill must define things. So before we know it, if we have a Bill of Religious Rights, religious people, and possibly many non-religious people, will be under the gun in the courts, and Parliament can't support them. It would be a very dangerous precedent and would backfire badly if a Bill of Religious Rights were used to further the power not of the people through the Parliament, but of the judiciary. And that's all I've got to say at this time, but if you would like to ask me a question or something, I'm happy enough to answer it. No? No? Yep.
So, Angela, could you comment briefly on the place of truth in the matter of religious rights? I mean, I understand this is not an area that we're very good at dealing with. I understand in the US, Satanists under religious freedom are doing stuff that...
This has been brought up. This was actually brought up by the industry bodies. What happens if somebody says their religion is some sort of, wacky do-it-yourself thing? And that's a problem. At the moment, I don't think we have this problem. This is why I think a bill won't work. Because a bill has to define religion, you see. At the moment, we have an idea of what religion is. We have a pretty clear idea about standard religion, if you know what I mean. If we have a bill, it's going to be very difficult to actually define that. I don't know. I'm quite out there to say this. I actually don't know how this can be, how this can be solved. I think Morrison made a very bad mistake saying that we were going to have a Bill of Religious Rights. I think a Bill of Freedom of Religion. The only parts of this bill that I think are really worth anything is the opening part, which basically says you can't discriminate against anyone because of their religious views. In other words, you can't employ someone, as was done once upon a time, you know, because they're a Catholic or because they're a Protestant or because they're Jewish, rather than looking at someone else. Okay? That's about it, as far as I can see. That's about the only thing which I can see where this has any value at all. And as a matter of fact, I can't see why we need it, because right now, I think you could bring an anti-discrimination case if you were discriminated in that way. But see, the biggest problem is going to be that if they have this bill, if we have a bill like this, it's going to be the anti-discrimination apparatus that's actually going to adjudicate.
You
Yeah.
changed your mind.
Yeah.
Chance that he might change it.
Well, I changed my mind because it didn't go into it very deeply at first. It sounded like a good idea, didn't it? After everything that was going on, I mean, I couldn't help thinking, you know, maybe we need a law about this, you know. The Israel-Folau situation has basically propelled the whole thing, I think. But what happened to Julian Porteous was worse, in my opinion, because that was an attack on fundamental doctrine. They've always, they know that the churches are the bulwark against the identity politics. It's identity politics versus the churches, really. That's really the way it is at the moment. Yeah. Yeah, Jim. Yeah.
Angela, have we crossed already that threshold? Because we do have religion defined in law. You know, it's what you believe or don't believe. You know? So I think it's already defined. And
I don't know whether it's just what you don't believe, what you believe, or what you don't believe.
Yeah, well, it encompasses an atheistic view, for instance. You know, so it's under the law, under the definition of religion in some laws, it is your belief or unbelief, both are religion. But the other thing is, you know, when you say it's better to leave it as it is, but it's not working as it is now, as Porteous and Folau and almost 100 other cases that have come before HOLA or become, you know, known to us. And many of them are working on.
I agree with you. I don't think it's working the way it is, but I'm not sure that a law that tries to define all this is the way that it's going to work. I think you have to look at the other end of the spectrum as to why it isn't working the way it is. I mean, identity politics is the thing that's propelling this, and that's a very big problem. What do you think? I mean, seriously, what do you think? I'd like to know what you think, actually.
Sorry, I'm just not sure whether, and I'm not as close to this as you might assume I am, but it seems to me there is very much a justification for a religious anti-discrimination bill. I agree with you, the less it's said, it's probably the better. I agree with you that we don't want a religious rights bill because that just opens the door to other rights bills, which will ultimately become a Charter of Rights or Bill of Rights, and that we don't want because it will be used against us.
Anti-discrimination bill, which would be limited.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But
well,
if it made clear that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of religion, you know.
See, when Folau made his remarks, the point was that they were going to, and they are arguing this as an industrial dispute, not a religion versus, you know, Qantas secular view dispute. It's being argued not as a rights case, but as an industrial case, that you're expected to comport yourself in some way outside work in a certain way. And there is some argument for this. After all, teachers, for example, are expected to comport themselves. Other footballers are expected to comport themselves even though they don't in a certain way, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. So that's the way they're going to argue that.
If I could just say, I think that the point that should be made, you know, is that we don't want any more than anyone else in society does, really. In that we want a right which is a universal right, applies to religion the same way it does to free speech and conscience by a whole span of expressions of those, you know. And that every company should have the right to fire anybody who doesn't work to its purpose or works against its purpose. They should have. And that's all we want for our schools and our churches and all the rest.
But then they would argue the same with Israel Folau.
No, well, the other because the other thing that we need to demand is that no company, and most Australians would agree with this because they hate companies, the big companies especially, no company should be able to fire someone for their personal beliefs, and particularly with those expressed outside the workplace. And I think if we keep to those two things, you know, I just can't see how we can lose.
Yes. Well, his situation is a little bit different because he's a public figure. That will cause the problem. I always take the devil's advocate part, Jim. You have to constantly think about what the opposition are going to do and say.
Just look at that. You know, you rightly said, debunked the idea that whether you're employed with a company that's earning over 50 million a year or nothing shouldn't make any difference. Well, I'd say it's exactly the same whether you're high profile or low profile. And perhaps if you're low profile, you need more protection.
Well, I don't know. I mean, being a person who deals with people in public life, and having been in the public eye myself, I can tell you that there is a certain expectation about what you say and do. I've crossed the line a couple of times according to the higher-ups, and I've been in strife over that. They tried to sack me at one stage. In fact, in one job I did get the sack, so, you know, sorry.
I will keep crossing the line now.
Yes?
I just want to make a comment. I have spoken to some constitutional lawyers, and with section 116, where it says there'll be, of the Australian Constitution, there'll be no law made about religion. But the problem is...
No law to establish religion.
Establish a religion.
Yeah.
And they, I believe the original founders meant religion meaning denomination. You know, like we've got all the different, you know, Catholics, Protestant and Anglicans and all the different...
Yes, but they also said there'd be no test for religion. Now that meant, in their terms, that you weren't allowed to, in the public service, that you could do it privately actually, even after the Constitution, after 1901, but in the public service there was no test for religion. So you couldn't say whether a person was religious, non-religious, or whether they were a Church of England or whether they weren't. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's what that particular point referred to. However, I would like to point out the fact that Justice Kirby himself, during the marriage debate, actually said, well, they had a view of marriage which was marriage in 1901. We have a view of marriage now which is marriage now, because actually Mr. Howard thought about this. He thought about this in relation to marriage, because marriage is mentioned in the Constitution. So he was saying, and there were other people saying the same thing, that marriage, as it was thought of in 1901, was marriage between a man and a woman. So we can't really change that. There were even some people who were pushing for a referendum on that point, to say whether or not we could redefine that point in the Constitution. That would have been a very big thing, and I don't think it would have gone. But then again, you know, no. You see what I'm saying? So all they have to do is redefine religion as they see it now, rather than religion was in 1901. Because that's what we've done anyway with marriage. So there's lots of things, you see.
Religion used to be denomination, and now religion is Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism.
True. Everybody in 1901 had a religion. When it was all put down on the census, everyone had a religion, and until the most recent census, everyone still did have a religion because it was asked for on the census. This is the first year that there's ever been a census where the main thing on to tick the box was no religion.
Sorry, Angela. Reverend Peter Rose says, made this comment. He's unable to speak at the moment, so he's written it down for you. Thank you.
So Peter Rowe has written, a freedom of religion bill would have to give exactly the same protections and privileges to any and all religions and faith, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, though is it a religion? Good question. Satanism, Druidism, and some Baal worship. Oh, I haven't heard of that one. Do we want this? Not necessarily, no. I'm sorry. I think actually Christianity, Islam, Judaism are the great Abrahamic faiths, aren't they? So, I mean, yes, I'd say that you'd have to, you can easily define those, but you can't define a lot of this. It's true. So where are we going to go from here? Yes, that's a very good point. I think we just have to keep on fighting you have to keep on fighting the identity politics. And one group that's come out fighting the identity politics with both fists is the women's movement, which I find really interesting because unfortunately they strung themselves up on their own petard a little bit, because the women's movement were in favour. The women's movement found common cause with the LGBTI movements and also with transgenderism, until all of a sudden transgenderists are saying that they're women. That really got on their nerves. And I don't blame Germaine Greer and Julie Burchill, who's an English commentator who's pretty out there. She said, you can't cut off your bits and take a whole lot of hormones and wear a dress and then go around saying that you're a woman. Because it's true. I mean, that's true. So I suspect that there might be a bit of a fight going on in a lot of the identity movements. I mean, the politics of this is very, very weird. Very weird. And it is a very small group of people, but they manage to have a lot of influence. And they're influential because they're clever, and they're often in quite highly placed positions. It's very hard when you write for a big daily newspaper to put yourself out there on these things. And I can tell you, people have a lot of different views. Even amongst my own kids, talking to them, it's amazing that, for instance, transgenderism, which I think even I'm talking about my children here, a few years ago would have said there's a load of rubbish. I mean, poor people are unfortunate. This is a terrible thing a terrible cross to bear in your life. But it's not something that you can turn into a great political movement, and that's what they're sort of trying to do. And I think this could be the undoing of the whole thing in the end. I mean, it's an emperor's new clothes thing. And somebody has to, people have, and it's interesting that it's the women's movement that's done it, saying, no, you haven't got any clothes on. No. Yeah. But see, what about this? See, this is a problem. This is a problem that you're going to have to define your religion. Huh? You don't think it's a problem, Jim?
No, I don't think it's a problem, because what I assume we're alluding to there, Peter, is that if you have a religion that says that you're allowed to sacrifice people,
of course, and of course Islam is often pointed to because of all the terrorism. But you see, the fundamentals of the Islamic faith don't approve of terrorism.
And whatever we said in law, anti-discrimination law, will not negate the requirement to still operate within the law in every other sense. So I don't see any problem with that, and I think we've got to accept as Christians that everybody should have freedom of religion. We should accept the fact that Muslims and all these have freedom of religion. I'm not a bit afraid of that, because God wills. And if we're afraid of that, I think we should be worried. Right? Because God wills.
Yeah, well, I've been criticised for this because I wrote a piece supporting women who want to wear head coverings. Mainly because I can't see that that's got anything to do with anything. And I've sat on the same podium as Islamic women, and I have no quarrel with anybody as long as they're not, supporting people who are blowing people up. I think we just have to accept this. there are Muslims who live... I actually lived in Sydney. This might interest you. A lot of people asked me after I wrote that piece, because it caused a big thing in the paper. I have a lot of people, you know, you get all these, you know, what do you call it, questions and answers. And I know I don't do social media. A lot of people saying, has Angela Shanahan gone mad? Why is she writing all this stuff supporting women wearing the hijab? Blah, 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 blah. Because in Sydney, when I lived in Sydney before I moved to Canberra, I had Muslim neighbours on both sides. And I was used to this. By the time I came to Canberra, a lot of people were only just getting used to the idea. But my neighbours on both sides were ordinary ladies like me who looked after their kids, did their shopping and, you know, had to manage, you know, and a lot of them had very big families too. It's another thing we had in common. My neighbour Yusuf once said to me, I came waddling out, I was pregnant with my 7th child, and he said to me, Angela, how many kids you got now? And I said, oh, this will be the 7th, Yusuf. He said, 7 kids. You could be Lebanese. So it's just, yes, sorry, I'm sorry.
Angela, when I read through this religious discrimination bill, it was one point, and this is why I'm seeking a bit of clarification, when it was talking about goods and services, that there couldn't be discrimination there. My mind then thought of a scenario, say a Satanist religion church or a Muslim church wanted to book a Baptist or Pentecostal hall.
They made a point about that. You couldn't do that. If you were, for example, wanted a gay wedding in a church hall, you had the right to say no if it was a church hall, but not if you were running a commercial business, a wedding venue business, say, for example. Yeah, that is in the thing. The NCC did an enormously long forensic examination of the bill. They put in a submission. If anyone is interested in getting a copy of it, I can send it to you, or you can get it from them, I suppose. My email is angelamshanahan@bigpond.com. If you want to send me an email, I could send it on to you. It is a very complicated area. They want to hang on to the exemptions. They think if we give away the exemptions, that will be the first chink. Religious freedom bill or no religious freedom bill, they want to hang on to the exemptions, because there is a view that if we have a religious freedom bill, we won't need the exemptions. No, that's not going to work. So, I don't know. Anyone else have a different idea? No. You see, part of it is we just have to accept too. We can't. You have to accept Australia is a varied multicultural country. It really is. I mean, that word started to take on bad connotations, multicultural, but I don't think it's a bad term. We don't come from a single homogenous cultural group. I mean, I know this growing up. Even I'm half Italian, and I was actually considered to be the weirdo girl because I went to this hoity-toity sort of school in the eastern suburbs where there were no Italians except one family who were incredibly rich, and that was it. And you know, I have a bit of an idea of what it must be like to grow up in a minority group. It's very difficult. And in a religious minority group, it's even more difficult. You know, you're trying to explain, you know, yourself to people. Well, people are not going to necessarily want to know. And the usual Australian view is keep it to yourself. Don't talk about it. In fact, when I just tell you this, when I first started writing about religion, a lot of people on the paper thought, Angela's a religious nut. Actually, I'm not. I'm just a very ordinary type of Catholic. I'm not particularly devout. People used to say, oh, the Shanahans are very devout because they have 9 children. The Shanahans are a bunch of mugs. That's what the Shanahans are. But anyway, no, it struck me absolutely when 9/11 happened, actually. Here we are in a small, basically ex-colonial outpost at the end of the world, and all this stuff is happening, and it's all being propelled by religion. Religion is the main motivating force in the world. You don't want to forget that. There's a couple of very, very good books being written about this. People don't realise how important the religious motivation is. They also, Christians I think feel particularly like this, they don't realise how important it is in other parts of the world. We think of ourselves as the world, the West is the world. The West is not the world. You know, I went to a conference at the Vatican in 2013. I was very privileged to be asked to this conference, and I actually saw the Pope every single day and even at dinner. The world, when I saw all the people in the conference, I can tell you, we Westerners were a little bit of a rump group sitting over there, you know, sort of together. A number of Africans and Indians, and particularly Africans, I have to tell you, just was overwhelming. It's very difficult to say, in the Catholic world you get a sense of this because it's such a big religion, and it's so for want of a better word, multicultural. And of course their concerns and our concerns are completely different. They think we're crazy. One woman actually said to me, she's a terrific speaker, what's her name? Oh, I can't remember her name, but Teresa Okafor, that's her name. She said to me, you know, all that was going on about gay marriage and everything, don't you understand what's natural? She said, you can't change gravity. I said, no. But she said, one day you'll learn, you know. And another thing, we were talking about euthanasia and stuff like that. Well, they're talking about why is it in some of the big cities now people are not actually looking after their own people with their own 2 hands, you know. So their views and our views are completely different. So having gone to this conference, I had a very different view of how the world is actually panning out. So it's very hard for us living in this type of world, but I think we have to realise we're not the world. There is another world out there. It's good for us to get our children out into that other world too, so that they experience it and they understand. A lot of them that have given up their faith or whatever, once they get out there, they suddenly realise that there are things that are keeping people afloat who might not even have the daily necessities, but they have that. Which, you know, people... Sorry. Yeah.
How do you maintain the balance of addressing some of these issues that seem insidious, like identity politics, but also remain profoundly practical in your attitude and what you produce in response to those things? Because I think that's a balance that is a great example.
Look, I'm no great example. I can tell you, I have a family of 9 children we have everyone from the gay rightists, and I'm not kidding, just gay rights, I'm talking about gay, full-on gay, my eldest son's gay, right down to a member of the National Party. And when we sit at the table, the National Party person and his wife and me and a couple of others, and we there's a gradual sort of line going up to the gay rights people up the other end. I mean, you've got to look at it, and it's funny, you know. I mean, there's humour in everything, and we don't fight. There was only one time they ever had a fight, and it was during the gay marriage thing, which only goes to show this stuff actually propels nasty undercurrents even in families, because one of the girls put on a speech that Matt Canavan did on marriage, And so the gay writer still carried on about it and said it was nasty and this and that. And of course it wasn't at all. And their father had to actually intervene a bit. But basically they get on very well. They like one another. They get on well. You can't say just because this person is a totally different person from me, this person doesn't believe these things. You have to understand that in a family particularly, you've got people that depend on one another. There are certain parameters, there are certain limits. I won't allow, or well, I shouldn't say I because I'm not really, we can't allow people to, cross the line and be nasty to one another. It's as simple as that. We try very hard to get on. It's as simple as that. And it's the same anywhere else, in the workplace or anywhere else, not just in your family. People say rather offhand, oh, I've got quite a few friends who are gay. I have actually. I've had a couple of very good friends who are gay, and it was very hard for one of them in particular because he became a Catholic, and it was very hard for him with his friends. Once that starts to happen, when you know who your friends are, it's as simple as that, But I don't know whether you're also talking about the balance that you keep in a family. With me writing all this stuff, that's hard too. I have to be very careful. When they were younger, I used to talk about them all the time. And then as they started to get older, they realised that Mum was writing this stuff in the paper and hang on, that's me. You can't say that about me. I said, but I didn't say anything bad about you. I just said you happened to be, doing all this stuff and, you were doing really well and all this. Oh no, you can't even mention me. I'm invisible. I'm invisible man. As a matter of fact, I actually mentioned a couple of my daughters in an essay I wrote for the quarterly essay to say that, I had to answer Annabelle Crabb. She was writing stuff about, I don't know, people think of a family as an ideological construct, not a real thing, and that's when all this stuff about what women do comes into it. So she was saying, Annabelle was saying, too many women are going out to work and not enough men are coming back into the family to take paternity leave and so forth. And I just said, look, oh God, who cares? I mean, this stuff isn't rocket science. It just gets to the point where you think, well, if they want to take paternity leave, fine. If they can't, if they're a tradie trying to build up a business, for example, they can't. So, big deal. And anyway, I wrote this stuff, but I also used the example of two of my girls, both of whom, they have 5 children between the two of them, and their husbands have taken a bit of paternity leave, but not much. But those girls, and one of them in particular, is very high up in the public service, and she's actually at director level, and she has actually managed to do all that with her 3 kids, basically taking leave, doing the sort of things, because she has wonderful conditions. So I just use them. Well, I have to hide the thing, because if she finds out, she'll be furious with me, So, to be frank with you, and at the actual practical thing, I got a lot of the ideas from what I wrote about family and society from them, and from bringing them up. And also living in a place where I do have 2 Islamic neighbours, and we're living in a pretty kind of ordinary area of Sydney, I can tell you. We were not living in any great, area or anything like that. And just the ordinary stuff that you do, a lot of people, a lot of women writing on newspapers don't know anything about that stuff. Particularly when I started over 20 years ago, they were living in a different world from me. So that's the whole story of balance. I started writing about the family life balance quite seriously, but it's started to become an area where people aren't quite as interested anymore, because people have figured it out, and women are voting with their feet, particularly women. So, is that all? Nobody else wants to ask me anything? Well, we have to all think about this now, because this is coming up, this Bill of Rights thing, and not Bill of Rights, legislation for religious rights, and you're going to have to start thinking about, you know, whether you're going to support it or not, and how much you're going to support, and how far we should go. I have to say, I think we should do as little as possible, minimal as possible, and I can tell you a certain ex-Prime Minister agrees with me and thinks that they shouldn't touch it, that it's too dangerous. Things could end up worse. Mm.